Hi, this is Alex Bryan, President of East West Associates. Appreciate you all taking the time to hop on for this webinar about feasibility studies and the effect that the future tariffs landed costs from China are going to affect the business. Appreciate you all taking the time to come on. We've got a large group today signed up, so we'll move through this and we'll keep this at an hour basis. To start off, we're going to have, there are 5 parts here. Part 5 is just a brief follow-up. Part 1 here is a brief introduction of East West. The webinar series introduces the speakers. Then we're going to get into what's going on in China, what are the critical considerations. And then part 3 and 4 are the guts of today's presentation. It's going to be on the feasibility studies. We get 3 examples of feasibility studies from real-life examples from clients, manufacturers who are trying to address proactively the upcoming tariffs, and then finally the Q&A discussion. So we'll start off, if we could, we'll start off initially just introducing East West, explain who we are. We're an operations execution firm. We operate on the ground, as you can see, in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Poland, Central Eastern Europe, and also the U.S. The people that we have, the executives of East West, are all living in country. We got boots on the ground in all of these regions, and all of them have responsibilities for running Western multinationals on the ground in that country. And finally, we provide 4 services. The first is around global manufacturing supply chain footprint, which you can see here, and that's around global site selection, global footprint evaluation, analysis, the implementation, closing factories, relocating factories, moving facilities, and negotiating with governmental incentives when we're going into a new country and constructing a facility if necessary. Second area is operations commercial performance improvement. That deals a lot with our M&A practice, with our corporate turnarounds. We've seen quite a bit in China because there's not been such an oversight in going on in China since the start of COVID. We also do a lot of diagnostic and assessment work of facilities on the ground for clients to identify ways and costs to improve. Third area is supply chain, and that's everything related to identifying suppliers, qualifying suppliers, supplier improvement, supplier transition in all of those countries of China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Poland, Central Eastern Europe, and the U.S. We're also doing covert investigations of suppliers, but that's been a critical issue for companies trying to find alternative supply chain and subcontractors. And then the fourth area is human resources and risk management, and that is primarily a lot of interim general management work that we're doing on the ground for companies who've lost general managers at their facilities, as well as quite a bit of work on executive search for companies who are trying to find senior executives in all the markets where we operate. Here's a brief description again of where we are, those 5 countries. Here's a brief sampling of our client base. You can go on our website and see the additional lists, but these are representative samples of companies who have given us their approval. Now on the webinar series, we are now entering the 3rd webinar of the 6 webinar series. This is about country feasibility studies. We have upcoming one on the 3rd around doing the diagnostics of China operations. Then one on the 5th about metal sourcing, metal industry sourcing and supply chain in Mexico. And then a final one on December 11th around global manufacturing and supply chain footprint, and then the implementation of that. And that's really for clients who are trying to get a handle on their global manufacturing and supply chain and really get closer to their customer base. Much of that is what we're doing on the ground in China and Southeast Asia and Mexico and some in Poland. All right, as we now turn to the introduction of speakers, I would like to introduce our speakers today, one Mark Plum and one Jacob Miller, and myself, Alex Bryan, I'll be moderating. Mark, if you would take a minute and provide an introduction on yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. Yes, so my name is Mark Plum, and I've spent the majority of my life business working in Asia, probably over 40 years, having lived in Thailand and in China for over 20 years, running 2 fairly large multinationals in both Southeast Asia and Indochina, Thailand, as well as China and Shanghai. And then subsequently, I live back in the States now, and we do a lot of work as it pertains to China in the early years, growing businesses in China in the last 4 or 5 years is helping companies look for alternative sources of places to manufacture or source based on what's been going on in China the last 3, 4, 5 years. So an Asia guy for my entire working business career.
That's
Okay.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Jacob Miller. My background is an engineer. Originally, I spent about 9 years in Mexico, primarily doing technology transfer and turnarounds for operations and manufacturers in Mexico, setting up operations or helping them downsize. Then later on, I moved over to China, spent 14 years in China. Primarily the first half of that I spent setting up operations, setting up manufacturing operations, setting up purchasing offices, setting up different support organizations for companies. And then in the later half, primarily helping companies with their downsizing and the restructuring, and then their moving out of China policies with the China Plus One, helping them either developing new manufacturers in Thailand or Vietnam or Mexico or wherever. And then for the last 5 years, I've been based in Vietnam, primarily focusing on clients that are looking at their China Plus One strategy and looking to move out of Vietnam, out of China into Vietnam, and then also into Thailand and other places.
Great. You're in Ho Chi Minh today, I believe. Is that right, Jake?
I'm based in Ho Chi Minh City in the south of Vietnam, and I've been here for the last 5 years.
Great. All right. And my name is Alex Brown, president of East West. We will now kind of turn to the part 2 here about why manufacturers are relocating out of China. What are some of the critical considerations? I'm going to turn it over to Mark Plum. Ask Mark if he would take it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to get a 30-second history lesson, basically because I was there when it all began 25, 30 years ago in China. So what's happening in China over the last, well, starting in 30 years, we all went there for 2 reasons: really the large domestic market and inexpensive labor, and that worked really well for probably 10, 15 years. And then things began to change. For example, growing regulatory complexity. China then became much more difficult to do business in. Then as we kept developing in China, quite frankly, our IP was stolen by many places, and that created their increased domestic competition from what they learned from us. And then as moving forward a little further, then became a little bit more nationalistic. China 2025, which is really by Xi is really a buy China policy, and we all know about that. That's changed. And then of course and then subsequently starting in 2018, we had the first tranche of tariffs, and that for those who were shipping stuff back to the States, that has become and it is very problematic. And then next, of course, then COVID, and that really messed things up as far as supply chains and getting to visit. You couldn't go sometimes 2 to 3 years to go check on your operations. You couldn't do audits. You didn't know who was in charge, what was going on. Major problem. And then of course China then has it's begun to slow, and then combined with the fact that it's kind of a buy China program, those of us that are there to sell in China really feeling a pinch. And then lastly, and going on as we speak, just continued geopolitical uncertainty, what's going on as far as tariffs and geopolitical situations in Taiwan and all that kind of stuff. So what we see today is dramatically different than what we saw 30 years ago when a lot of us went to China, going back in the early years. Next slide. So yeah, this just kind of shows when the exodus, whether in other words, if you're in China for China, I mean you're selling there, you have to just improve your operations. But if you don't have to be there, where are people going? And now sometimes people answer the questions 2 or 3 times, but anyway, from our 150-hour survey, of course, Southeast Asia, of course, Thailand, Vietnam, exactly. Malaysia is a big venue, a big market, not a market, but people where they're going. Mexico, of course, particularly as its proximity to USA and the U.S.-China, U.S.-Canada tariff arrangements. And then some to Europe, of course, but it's really Southeast Asia and Mexico is where most of the people that are looking for a China plus one or a way to mitigate their China operations. Next slide. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
we're now going to turn to part 3, which is feasibility studies. And as I mentioned earlier, part 3 and part 4 are really the guts of this webinar. For those who are new to East West webinars, we want this to be just a good discussion, right? We've got two great subject matter experts who are on the phone with us today or on the call with us today. We want to take advantage of them, and it should be a good discussion. If you have questions, then please open up your control panel and go to questions and send those to us, and we will ask them. We've already got a lot of questions up front. Send us your questions. If we can't get to all the questions, we will then follow up after the webinar within 48 hours by either calling you or emailing you. But we're first going to look at the feasibility studies. And just for the point here, the feasibility studies that East West offers, these really are driven by a lot of concern that our clients are having, particularly in the last 2 weeks since the election, around the increasing projected, and again, we don't know, but projected increasing costs of doing business, the geopolitical concerns, potentially increased tariff and duties. And so that's kind of driven a lot of companies to try to figure out, okay, what do I need to do in the preparation for that? I've handled the 25% duties. So the feasibility studies really are supporting our clients, our manufacturing clients, who are trying to eliminate or mitigate the U.S.-China duties. And so the feasibility study gives clients actionable data to either identify alternative supply chain bases outside of China or identify alternative manufacturing locations out of China. And we've got 3 case studies. This is the first one. The 3 case studies are looking at different strategies, right? This one right here is around third-party contract manufacturing going from China to Vietnam. Case study 2 will be really is a project focused on getting components and assembly work in Mexico. And so that client was going from China to Mexico. And the third one is going to be where this client wanted to control their manufacturing, so they were relocating their manufacturing out of China to Thailand. So these are all 3 actual cases and what we did with the feasibility study and what the client did. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you, excuse me, Jacob, I'll turn it over to you and ask you to go through feasibility study number 1.
Yeah, this client of ours was an industrial equipment supply manufacturer. Their previous strategy is they purchased 100% of their components from China and then shipped those components to the US. They assembled them, loaded their software, tested the machine, and when everything passed, they would put it for sale in the US, which was their primary market. One of the things that they were looking at is all the components that they were bringing into the US were under the tariff, so they had to pay a large tariff to import their components. And after that, they also paid quite high labor rates to assemble their machines in the United States. So one of the first things that they wanted to look at is, would it be possible to just manufacture them in China to save on the labor rates? We did look at that. However, the issue is they still would need to pay the tariffs, and they would need to pay the tariffs on a higher cost machine versus just the cost of the components. This didn't really work for the client because it did save on the labor, but it didn't save on the tariff, which was kind of the primary thing that was driving the process. Next slide. Okay. One of the things that they basically asked us to do is they asked us to look at other areas where they could work with a contract manufacturer to move their manufacturing. Because the machines are not that big, they could ship them fairly easy, and the cost of the shipment wasn't a major concern for them. We did a analysis of different locations, primarily Vietnam, Thailand, and Mexico. And in Mexico, especially because it's next to their main market, which was the U.S., and it looked like that might be an option for them. In addition to this process of looking at how they could work with a contract manufacturer using their current suppliers' components, they also wanted us to help them with an 18-month program to how we would localize these machines in that market, so they would be able to avoid any future tariffs because it would be made in another country, not China. Next slide. So basically, we worked in this with people like me that are living in country to look at the different options for them and who the local contract manufacturers that might work for this type of product. And we also worked on a localization plan to make sure that after the process, they would be able to localize the machine and have it made in another country other than Vietnam. In the end, what we did choose is to move the production to Vietnam. That did save them quite a bit of money on labor, since it's about 25% of the cost of what they would face in China, and about 10% of what they were currently paying or what they were paying in the U.S. Client would, of course, in the end, enjoy being able to bring it into the U.S. tariff-free and duty-free, so they would avoid the 25% tariff. And also Vietnam did have competitive labor rates, number of high-quality contract manufacturers that have experience in this industry, and a base of suppliers that have worked in this industry and know how to support the manufacturers in this industry. So in the end, we shortlisted basically 5 contract manufacturers and made a little presentation of the background of each of the suppliers, and then helped the client negotiate with the final contract manufacturer to get a manufacturing agreement in place and get that signed by both parties. Next.
Great. And so this part right here we have is this is the phase 1 of the feasibility study, where they want us to look at Vietnam and Thailand and Mexico. And so Jacob is going to go through this. It's obviously been sanitized for the client purposes, because it was, but we have wanted to share with you the sanitized version of how we got to identifying the Vietnam suppliers. Okay, Jacob, we go there.
Yep. Next slide. Okay. Our initial thing that we need to do is collect all the information on all the categories of the subcomponents of this machine, all the technical requirements, all the standards that are needed to be met, the volumes of each part, the current suppliers, so we can get a background information on them to be able to identify appropriate similar suppliers. And then next stage we did a quick analysis of identifying contract manufacturers that have experience in this industry, and that covered Vietnam, Thailand, and Mexico. And we identified a number of contract manufacturing suppliers that would be suitable in especially Vietnam and Thailand, and using our relationships within the country, business organizations, manufacturing organizations, other internal and external databases that we have to be able to identify potential suppliers that can do this type of work. And we put together a qualification process for the suppliers to make sure that they would be suitable for our client, both in financial means, technology, manufacturing capabilities, social responsibility, quality control processes, etc. After we collected all the information about the different contract manufacturers, we went through and did an auditing process to qualify them and pre-qualify them for the client to make sure that they would be suitable options. And then we put together basically a profile of each client, of each supplier, so that the client would have an idea of each supplier and know who they felt more comfortable with going forward with. Next slide. Basically, this is just kind of at the beginning we were looking at there's basically two different types of machines, two different sizes. These machines are basically manufactured by manufacturing 12 separate subassemblies. Seven of these subassemblies are subassemblies that they manufacture themselves, so they're bringing all the components in as parts. And other subassemblies, they actually have their suppliers in China manufacture the components and then assemble the subassemblies for them. All those parts are shipped to the US, and in general for these machines, it's about 5 hours of labor to assemble the machine. So just looking at the labor cost and the general ideas of what's going on. And then next thing we kind of looked at is if we look at who is exporting and manufacturing these type of machines and these type of components currently, what we see clearly is China has the majority of the exports in this area, but Vietnam also has a good chunk. Thailand has a good small amount, and Mexico is almost not even in this market. So at this point, we learn that it's going to be very difficult to identify anything in Mexico as a contract manufacturer. So then, of course, a factory and setting up your own factory would be the only option. Then next thing we looked at is we looked at labor rates, just so the client would have an idea of how the labor rates would compare to what they're seeing in China and what they're seeing in the US, giving them some general reference points of what electronics assembly workers are getting paid in this area, what minimum wages are, so they can have a comparison point. Next slide. And then the next thing we kind of looked at is what is the logistics gonna be for this type of item? You know, these rates have changed quite a bit over the last couple of years, but basically the idea would be that Vietnam was slightly cheaper than Thailand, and Mexico would be a different system. And then another thing we started to look at down at the bottom left, if we were manufacturing these machines in each country, what would be our tariffs, or what would be the taxes that we would expect to be paying on these machines or these components? And basically, if we're importing them or manufacturing them in Vietnam, Thailand, or Mexico, the tax is going to be 0. But if we do it in China, it's going to be the 25%. So the next thing we looked at is if we have to bring our components, and this is on the bottom right side, if we have to bring the components that we're currently manufacturing in China to a third country, what would the taxes look like? And through this process, we identified that if we take our Chinese components to Vietnam or Thailand, we wouldn't have to worry about any taxes. And in Mexico, some of the times we wouldn't have to worry about taxes, but sometimes we'd have to pay a 5% taxes on the components. So that also is another thing that make Mexico not particularly work. After this, we came to a short list of suppliers. Basically, the end result, we had 7 contract manufacturers that we identified in Vietnam. And then the next slide, we identified an additional 11 suppliers in Thailand. And each of the suppliers was doing different things. Some of them were doing full machine assembly, some were doing sub-assemblies of components that are necessary in this industry. So next slide. Okay, after reviewing all of these 18 contract manufacturers, we identified several manufacturers that had the technical capability and capability to actually manufacture these machines for us in Vietnam and Thailand. After our due diligence, we recommended 2 of the best qualified suppliers, and then the client selected the supplier that they felt most comfortable with, and they were based in Vietnam. We went through a sampling process and an approval process to get the machines approved that they would be able to manufacture them. And then at the beginning, they're doing 40% in Vietnam. And then by the end of this year, we'll go to localizing the rest of it in Vietnam. As a result of this, they have avoided the 25% tariff from China, and they've reduced their labor costs that they were paying in the US previously. Next slide.
That's great, Jacob. Thank you. That was kind of phase one, and this client did phase one, and then in phase two, they selected that manufacturer in Vietnam, and then we got them qualified up and running. So they're going to be 100%, as I understand, Jacob, 100%. They'll complete the relocation of their finished goods by the end of 2025. Okay, this is the second case study. This was a case study really about components and assembly, going from China to Mexico. This client of ours is a global elevator manufacturer. They got facilities in Europe and in China and North America. They historically do high-rise buildings. They were trying to expand into a new market sector, which is 5 to 15-story buildings. They had made the decision to supply that business from their China operation because they had the best cost structure in China, and also the U.S. facility and the European facilities were capacity constrained. So they were worried that if the product launch met expectations, they wouldn't be able to meet the demand. So they came to us and said they didn't have really much in Mexico, and they wanted us to build out a supply chain base for them to identify and qualify contract manufacturers in Mexico, and then follow up with them, the supplier setup and product qualification. So in that case, we started working with a client. The EWA team in Mexico identified and interviewed electromechanical contractors and key component suppliers, and we selected in the Monterrey area. Right, we looked at several areas, selected the Monterrey, knowing that that business, that was a good location to put it. We issued an RFQ package, and we started working through with the suppliers, getting the data, tabulating all the results. We sat down and met with the suppliers of the sheet metal cabinets, the wire harnesses, and then we would put together the local content analysis, because we had to make sure that the domestic content and the local value added did not subject the client to the duties they were trying to avoid if the product was not qualified as a product qualified properly. And then the EWA project manager, he coordinated quality testing, production planning, and production startup with these subcontractors, with these contractors, and then started the assembly. The end result of this was they have now gone through, our client accepted the contractor's quality systems. They accepted the PPAP and the prototypes, and they have 3 products they're introducing. One has now been approved. The other 2 are currently ramping up, and the client has now avoided the U.S.-China tariffs. So they were able to, and then goal to get away from the tariffs and the geopolitical risks that are coming out of China. They selected Mexico, and we were able to make it happen on the ground there. That went through a feasibility study, phase 1, and then a feasibility study, phase 2, to get that accomplished. And it took us a period of time to get that done in order to avoid the tariffs, but they are now, will have by the end of, I think, February, they'll have the other 2 products up and currently ramped for production. So that is the second case study, second feasibility case study. The third feasibility case study, this is really around going from China to Thailand, and this one's a little different. The first case study was around really third-party contract manufacturing. The second case study we just reviewed was really components and assembly. This one's really about a company that wanted to control their manufacturing, so they needed to relocate manufacturing out of China, and they were looking at Thailand and Malaysia. So Mark, I'll turn it over to you if I could.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, as Alex said, this is one where they really wanted to keep a tight control over their manufacturing, so a third party didn't make sense, and just sourcing components didn't make sense. So they really wanted to do a quick feasibility study as far to find some locations. USA company, electronics, fairly sophisticated, 3 plants, China, USA, and Germany. They were kind of up to their ears, or are up to their ears with what's going on. They went to China in 2008, like a lot of people. They got near the end of the golden years there, so to speak. And then now the board's concerned about geopolitical China to tariffs, labor costs, the regulatory environment in China, et cetera, et cetera. And they're a USA company, and when they're trying to sell to some of their Chinese tier ones, you know, they're being kind of shoved out a little bit because they're a USA company. So that 30% of what they're doing in China is decreasing, but in the 70% of their exports go to Southeast Asia a lot, and some back to the States. So we were engaged to do a feasibility study in both Thailand and Malaysia. And that's what we had preliminary recommended we should look, because we know that area already pretty well. We know the other areas, and for this begin to identify some areas for them to set up a manufacturing operation to early on to replicate what they're doing in China. Feasibility study in Thailand, Malaysia, to identify available sites for a manufacturing plant. Okay, and then this is when they say sites, it could be dirt, it could be pre-built factories ready to go, or a combination thereof. And then it also could be a WOFE and or a lease, a build and lease back. So different combinations, how they wanted to do it. They want to uncover and negotiate government incentives. We know those areas pretty well, and for a lot of manufacturers in the high-tech industry, both Vietnam and Thailand are aggressively pursuing. Then there's fit out costs. You got to again, clean rooms, all that kind of stuff. So you have to be able to have on the ground contractors, design engineers, etc. As the clean rooms can be pretty sophisticated. And then we also have to have a good idea of labor costs, and as we'll talk a bit later on, labor availability of skilled labor, because in many cases the labor cost isn't so critical as a percent of the total BOM, but having the skilled labor and the availability of the skilled labor is many times more important. We visited 15 business parks in Thailand and Malaysia, looked at sites, had their criteria, multiple places to look for efficiencies. We also visited other manufacturers that we know work closely with the American Chamber of Commerce, go see a lot of our friends who are producing products in Thailand, particularly down south and in the Rayong, Chonburi area, and just to find out who's down there, who's hiring, looking at government employees integrity, local labor markets, that kind of stuff. So when we do these things, there's like 15 or 20 criteria you go through. So then what happens is you go look at the industrial parks, and in Thailand, they're very sophisticated, and many of them are tied in, working closely with the federal or the national government. So WHA is just one of the larger ones, and you can see, you can't see the map so well, but it shows where the parks are, it shows where Bangkok is, it shows where the ports are, it shows where the airports are. So for ingress and regress, all that sort of stuff. So the south of Bangkok is really where a lot of the manufacturing is going. So anyway, good representation. Again, just a ready-built facility, pretty common, $6 or so a square meter. Some are ready to go now. Some are built to suit. In this particular one, if we would go over there, we have to bring contractors in to design a section of it for a clean room. But again, in these parks, very sophisticated, help you with your imports, your exports, your duties, all that kind of stuff. Next slide, please, Alex. Again, just another park. Again, it's quite very sophisticated. You can see this is a MODA, kind of a competitor at WHA. People in the steel, the auto, electronics, chemicals, they're all in there. Food and beverage, they're all in there. You can see this one is pretty heavily Japanese, 20% Europe, USA. But again, good, extremely professional operation. Next slide, please, Alex. Yeah, and then we also wanted to look at to Malaysia, and specifically Penang. Penang is where the big electronics section is. It's been that way, Japanese dominated for 35 years. Went through all kind of the same thing. Went and looked at different places to build, different places to invest, that sort of thing. Next slide, please, Alex. Just again, like in Thailand, just a representative, ready-built facility, ready to go. Again, pricing about the same, $6-7 a square meter. So nothing there that's, overly attractive. So we recommended that Thailand was a better location for three primary reasons. We found existing sites. 2 new sites were already available within 8 months. In all 5 cases, the fees were more competitive than in Penang, which is, of course, Malaysia, and certainly more than China. All sites were accessible from Bangkok. No internal travel, no flying internally. The one at Penang was a little bit more expensive. Big thing about Thailand, though, is Thailand is really aggressive. They lost a lot of business over the last 25, 30 years to China. So we've been working now for the last 5 years closely with the Thailand Board of Investment, and they are, and particularly for these kind of industries that are a little more electronic, they're very aggressive. We've certainly, with preliminary 6 to 8 years of corporate income tax holiday, and possibly an additional 5 years. So just a note on that, we took another company there about 3 years ago, a large manufacturing company out of the upper Midwest, and put a 50,000 square meter facility in, and got 10 years of no corporate income tax, and then an additional 5 years of 50%. So the Thai BOI is very, very supportive. So we can find different ways. And then, of course, labor rates, again, Thailand is, the main thing in Thailand is it's supported by good labor. It's supported by high tech labor. There's been a lot of electronics, and then now for some of more of the basic stuff, they're using some Burmese and Lao labor for more of your manufacturing pieces. So anyway, recommended Thailand, and they're very happy.
Mark, I think also in Thailand, the labor inflation rates are pretty low comparatively to China, Vietnam, which are kind of.
Well, yeah, they have been historically. As you know, China and Vietnam is top down. It's mandated by the government. Thailand is a market economy, so they realize they have to be competitive on their labor rates, or they'll lose them. They'll lose them to Vietnam or Malaysia. That's correct.
So I moved back here to the case study number 1. Jacob, you went through. We had 2 questions that have come across. One was about the process of identifying the alternates. I mean, we talk about conducting RFQs, asked whether we conducted RFQs or RFPs to determine suitability. And then they also wanted to know for phase 1 and phase 2, how long did phase 1 take to identify those 18 contract manufacturers, and then phase 2 about drilling down to them. How long did that process take for them?
Yeah, the process is kind of, always the same for these type of things. You're always trying to make a big list of companies that might be capable, and then you're doing an RFI, an RFQ process, and then doing some kind of an audit process to verify what information was provided in earlier phases correct, and then doing a summary for the client and going through the client to say, here's what we recommend, here's why we recommend it, here's why we think they're suitable for you, what's your opinion, and going through that to be able to make the best recommendation for them. And then the initial phase, usually around 8 weeks for this type of project to get to the short list of companies. And were you looking about the manufacturing part? I guess I might have messed that one up.
There was a phase 1. If you just find what phase 1 was and how long, phase 2, what that was and how long.
Oh, okay. But that's for the manufacturing, or that for the identification?
Well, for the first part, the phase 1's be more of the identification, right, of those 18 contractors and drilling down. And then phase 2 was more of.
Yeah, it's about 8 weeks for the initial phase, and then another month or so for the second phase.
Yeah, Jacob, would you'd say that the first phase is you're really doing a lot of on the ground work, and then as you shortlist, then you bring your client comes out to so he doesn't have to go through 18 facilities. He can go through 4 facilities, and then you can really get the client involved to see.
That also depends on the client, because some clients want to see everyone, and other clients, they say, okay, if especially if it gets to a list of 18. Most clients say, hey, we only want to come and look at the top 5. We don't have time to come and visit 18. So then they'll ask us to just shortlist it down so they only have to deal with, a couple some factories to visit and a couple factories to evaluate.
Yep.
Yeah, and then we stayed on and we're now assisting them in the transition. But that's really worked between that client and that contract manufacturer in Vietnam. And that occurred over a short 3.5 months. So I just want
to really, again, for, as Jacob was saying, it's really 3 phases. So the first phase is Jacob's been working many hours in helping bring the components in from China, because that in of itself is can be very, very laborious, right? And then, but you got to get, that's how you build those two units, right? Then your next step is, okay, what can I localize quickly? Fasteners, low end stuff. What can I do that pretty quickly? That's going on right now. And then Jacobs, now we're also working with the supplier to begin to help identify more of the long-term higher cost components. So at the end of 2025, there may not be any components or anything left in China. It's all vertically integrated in Vietnam.
Yeah, and especially that last phase is a bit difficult because you have components that need molds. You need things that have a lot of approvals and a very long time process for the approval. For this machine especially, there were some components that are running at very high speeds that they need to be long-term tested. They have a very strict testing process. So even though we might have a supplier that can do it and it looks ready, it's still quite a elaborate and several month process to get that part approved. Once the tooling's approved, once the part is provided and tested.
Great. The another question just popped up, and we'll move to the remaining questions down here at the end of the slide. But a question just popped up here, which was around, it says, how has the U.S. as an option compared to these other geographies? Increasing concern about additional tariffs may be levied on other competitive manufacturing geographies. So the question really is around how, if there are additional tariffs lobbied onto China, then really these other regions, and we'll get to this question, are like Southeast Asia and Mexico. How are they faring? And I think the answer is right. A lot of companies are aggressively looking at Southeast Asia and Mexico simply to mitigate and avoid these tariffs. Right, and that's really.
Yeah, and maybe the question also is the question also, how do we know that there's not going to, that these other countries, the USA might put these tariffs on these other countries as they did in China, and so sometimes you have treaties. In the case of Thailand, you have the Treaty of Amity, which has been in effect for over 100 years. So there's good long-term relations and good in some treaties that would make it more difficult if you would try to change those and begin to duty products that have Thai content. Mexico, USMCA in Mexico, right? So you have some contractual arrangements. Not that things can't change, but it gives you a little more confidence that where you're going in those 2 areas, that you've had some treaties.
That's
and
a great
the geopolitics of Vietnam also, the U.S. wants more influence and is trying to bring Vietnam more into the sphere of influence of the U.S. So the U.S. will try to be friendly to Vietnam and keep them in the U.S. center instead of moving towards China or other countries. So it's very little risk on even the Vietnam side.
Sure.
Yeah, good point.
Well, that's a perfect segue. And the first question was about tariffs. We can see the questions there around what countries offer trade agreements with the U.S. To help reduce 25% tariffs from China to the U.S. And then how does one approach the analysis of low content substantial transformation to get local country requirements? And that is a critical piece of this. So this is just an initial slide here. Look at those 2 questions. And we've got down some bullet points here for everyone who's registered and watching. These bullet points are not at all exclusive. there's a lot more information, but this is just initial bullet points. But so, Jacob, I'll turn to you first here around the correct question around local content and substantial transformation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things in Vietnam is everything's kind of flexible, and it depends on where you're located, what industrial zone, what industry, what are you actually manufacturing. At times we see that we can get a made in Vietnam certificate with only 30% local content. However, we generally recommend our clients that you should be targeting 51%, because just because Vietnam says that this is made in Vietnam doesn't mean that when you bring it in the US that they're going to accept at 30% that it's made in Vietnam. The US may reject that and say it needs to be 51%. So it's always good to at least target the 51%, even if you can get initial approval with a lower percentage.
Yeah, yeah. In Vietnam, as you said, Jacob, and it's true over the last few years, they've been kind of guilty. The Chinese have been kind of guilty of trying to, quote unquote, do monkey kits, running finished goods or almost finished goods through Vietnam to the USA and trying to get, low duties. And that game is over, and the U.S. Customs is watching that quite closely.
In the U.S. is especially watching. If you have a Chinese supplier and you're encouraging them to move to Vietnam, that supplier is going to be watched extra hard, because they are considered high risk by the Vietnamese government, and they are considered high risk by the U.S. government. So they're not going to make it easy to just put together two components and call it made in Vietnam. And if you're a foreign company and you're setting up your own facility, then you might have an easier time than pushing your Chinese supplier to move to Vietnam.
Yeah, Mark, you and I have conversations with the attorney recently up in Milwaukee about the customs officials in the U.S. and how much they are turning the screws down. And
that's right. Yeah, and whenever you decide to do anything, we always recommend you get your local USA attorneys, because that's where they come in to work locally with local customs and customs brokers in the States. So as Jacob said, we're satisfying both the country of export, let's say it's Vietnam, and the country of import, in this case, the United States. So everyone's agreeing that this product has been substantially transformed, and then it meets the duty structure of that country. In the case of Vietnam, to the States would be zero.
Right. The second question was, we're talking about countries offering trade agreements with the U.S. I put down there points 4 through 7. Mark, you were talking about Thailand Treaty of Amity. Can you just touch on that briefly?
Well, as I said, it goes back to Teddy Roosevelt. So it's just a long, you have duty privileges, you have USA you have privileges as far as owning land, you have privileges as far as getting visas, privileges as far as setting up back office arrangements. It just makes doing business in Thailand as a U.S. company much easier. And I've done that. I've done it a couple, 2-3 times over 30 years, and they are wanting to attract a USA investment for sure.
Yeah. The next questions we had, these questions were put together in preparation for this webinar. But again, if you have additional questions, we got these questions, and we got 5 more from the audience. Here was a question about industry concentration, supplier networks. Jacob, if you would tackle this for Vietnam, and we talk about Mark, Thailand, and Mexico.
There are a lot of different industries coming into Vietnam, but one of the big one is furniture. There's a lot of furniture manufacturing that's been moving out of China into Vietnam. Electronics assembly has been really exploding over the last couple of years, and especially for more labor-intensive electronics assembly products. That's quite a lot of these factories moving out of China into Vietnam, even though they do have to rely on a lot of components from China. And then also, really what's been announced a lot in the last couple months has been a lot of semiconductor related factories coming into Vietnam. So you can see that Vietnam is moving up the value chain.
Yeah. Yeah, as far as Thailand, we kind of say internally, Thailand was China before China was China, right? So electronics is strong, then automotive extremely strong. Petrochemicals upstream and downstream really quite strong. Heavy to medium to heavy manufacturing, appliances, HVAC, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, and very most of it very sophisticated. Now, of course, the big thing there, EVs are kind of their new push on automotive. So, but a lot of good stuff.
And in Mexico, obviously, we're seeing, right, there's lots of metal stamping, fabrication, wire harnesses, injection molding. They've got a very good medical practice. It's built out on the western part near Tijuana. That's kind of where the medical industry is. They've got a large automotive, and it's a growing, and it's really been compounding in the last 7-8 years in Mexico. And that's brought all those tier 2 and all those tier 3 suppliers. That's the benefit. The downside is if you are going to be sourcing or relocating manufacturing in Mexico, you got to be very careful about getting too close to the automotive, because the prices, the wages they're paying are much higher than industry averages in Mexico. But the level of sophistication in Mexico has really jumped up a lot this last 7 to 8 years. Okay, well, the next question came really around foreign investment incentives. Mark, I'll let you take this one if you wouldn't mind.
Well, yeah. So again, we're kind of comparing in this case. Well, actually, all three countries. So I would say, and we do a lot of business in all three, and I've done a lot in all three. Thailand is by far and away the most organized. In Thailand, if you work with the Board of Investment, which is at the federal level, and you get their approvals, they call it A1 through B10, and let's say A3. That would say you would have 10 years of no corporate income tax at all and 5 years of 50% corporate income tax. And that permeates on down to the industrial parks, and it's all done, it's all negotiated out of Bangkok nationwide. Jacob will talk a little bit later. Vietnam's different, as in China was different too. A lot of it's by the industrial park and by the local province, and sometimes that makes it easier because one park is negotiating against another park. But the problem with that, and we've certainly seen that in China over the years, is they can renege on going down the road 3 or 4 years. The park may say, changed my mind. Local province may say, changed their mind. So it's a lot more fragmented. And then, of course, Mexico, there's a big line of people to go in there. So they're really not offering a lot of incentives. Where they are offering incentives is around labor training, labor investment, that sort of stuff. So you wouldn't pick a country based on the incentives, but it becomes part of the 8 or 10 or 12 metrics that you put together that could make a difference one way or the other.
Yeah, if you're moving your operation there, Mark, I think the client last time we took from Wisconsin to Thailand when they relocated out of China, I think their big thing was that they got 10 years, no taxes, half tax on 5 years, but they noted they weren't going to make any money the first 3 years. So that gave them really 7 years of producing, making money that they really weren't going to pay the taxes.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of times you'll see places that give you 5 years. Well, it might take you 3 years to even turn a profit to have tax. So you have to have a long enough ramp, a runway to make those incentives. And then these, like Thailand particularly, then if you add more, if you want to add to your facility, like we did with this one case down in Rayong, where we took the Wisconsin company, their 500,000 square foot facility. I think they've added on now 150,000, and that's under BOI invested, so they get additional benefits. In addition, in Thailand, the BOI has a whole. They'll help you find local suppliers that are also BOI invested companies. So it makes life. They try to make life as easy as they can on you to encourage you to go there.
Yeah. We've sure got good relations with them. That's helped. Jacob, on the questions around labor costs and availability, right? I mean, one thing you and Mark have talked a lot about was the lower labor costs in Vietnam, obviously, but talk about the labor costs, when it's critical, when it's not, and the two most important things about the availability of labor and the skill set, how critical that is.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the industry you're in, and there could be a lot of available labor in one part of the country and no no people available in another part of the country. You could get substantially higher cost of labor just because you need some specific skill that's just not available in, say, Vietnam. One of the things that we often talk about with our clients, and our clients are very worried about the labor rates, but then when you look at their labor, and it's only a very, very small percentage of their cost. So it's like you really shouldn't worry about it so much. I mean, we just had a talk with a client a week ago, and in the end, their labor was only 8% of their cost. So it's much more important of how we focus on the strategy for localizing their components than it is about worrying about the labor. We know the labor is cheaper than China, and it's only a small percentage of the cost anyway.
Right. Mark, would you add anything to that? No, I mean, it's as you said, if labor is, everyone's gotten, we don't want to chase cheap labor, because that's probably the worst thing you can do. And that's what Jacob is saying is, and then if it is cheaper, so you're saving 10% of 8%, right? So 0.8 of 1%, right? What it was, it's irrelevant. It's availability and skill set, which is critical. Yeah. Okay, 100% agree with that. The next question here was the next question I had about shipping costs, real estate, construction matters, reliance on China, and then other country considerations. Just looking at the shipping costs, Mark, can you tackle this? I know you had comments around the small electronics versus the large and bulky, and about the cost of Mexico versus.
Yeah, I mean, we know that, guys. If obviously, if you're trying to put refrigerators into a container in Thailand and ship them, you put 50 into a $4,000 to $5,000 container, then freight becomes, pretty, can be a big piece of it, right? So you don't do that. You build that kind of stuff closer to consumption. So if you're in Thailand or Vietnam, a lot of times the electronics and the smaller stuff and the stuff that packs better and packs well, furniture, in the case of Vietnam, really knocks down well. Your cost, the cost of freight in your BOM is not as critical. And then then you got to be also be very careful. For example, we had one client that was asking us to take a look for them because they wanted to south of Mexico City, right? And looking for some manufacturing down there because they thought it was cheaper labor near Guatemala, the whole deal. Okay, fine. We did find some cheaper labor, but the cost to get that truck through the whole continent of Mexico into Chicago was about $5,000, which is about the same price to get a container from Thailand to Chicago, is about $5,000, right? So you got to really look at those things, make sure you're being penny wise and pound foolish. Chase a lot of cheap labor in southern Mexico and then give it all back in freight. So that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Jacob, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, the only thing that I'd kind of add to that is you should look at, also if you're looking at Mexico, your transportation rates are going to be more stable. It's not going to change as much as on a percentage or a dollar amount as in Thailand or Vietnam. We've had a lot of political issues and other things happen that have drove the price of containers way up and way down. But with the Mexico border, it goes up and down, but it doesn't go up and down as much as it does when you're talking from Southeast Asia. So that can be a factor that you can look at depending on what industry you're talking about.
Yeah, good point. Yep.
Good point. Okay, when we're looking at a reliance on China, and again, one of the questions was about, can you source components from China and then ship in several other countries? And if you're bringing in these components from China, how are you handling that? Jacob, why don't you talk about that? You used this was some of the examples you talked about.
Yeah. We have a number of clients, and it's a lot of the clients kind of go into the three-phase thing. At the beginning, they will use a lot of their current Chinese suppliers, just ship all those components to Vietnam for assembly, train their staff, get the factory up and running, and then later on they go to the phase two where they source all the standard components, a screw, a bolt, a computer chip that's standard, and they'll start sourcing those locally. And then they start then they start going into the sourcing the more hard parts. Maybe you have some plastic injection molding that you need your molds for, or you have some PCBs that you need to have a long approval process, or you have some high-speed machine parts that you have a long approval process, and then you do that third, and then hopefully over that process you localize enough of the machine or whatever you're trying to make, and you'll have it over the 51%. You'll get a made in Vietnam label, a made in Thailand label, and then you won't have to worry about how much the reliance on China is for those components, and worrying about whether you'll be able to import it in the US without any tariffs.
Very, very good. We had two more questions here. One was around real estate and construction matters. And the questions were about the countries offering the ability to cost effectively lease or purchase land, build to suit manufacturing plants, and then about the ability to find those facilities, or do you have to build them on your own? Mark, why don't you take us a little bit through Thailand, if you would, and Thailand.
Yeah, sure. I can yeah, so all the countries are already pretty sophisticated. Thailand, not only do you have industrial parks, you have great architect and engineering firms, you have great general contractors, you have ways so you can come in, you can buy the land, you can negotiate have your architects and engineers take your plans and localize them to the standards of Thailand. Then from there, you can go out to general contractors, put the facility out to bid, get minimum 4, 5, 6, review those. Then you can put project managers in. The most recent one you're talking about, Alex, the Wisconsin company. We bought the land, they bought the land until we built the factory. We project managed it. We helped them with the architects, engineers, helped them with the general contractors, and then project managed. And 18 months later, we cut the ribbon for a world-class manufacturing facility. So Thailand makes it easy. Some of the same industrial parks actually have moved up to Vietnam now. WHA, as I mentioned earlier, and Amada, as you saw on the Thailand piece, are now also in Vietnam. So a lot of sophistication going on up there, and Jacob can speak more about that than I can.
And in Vietnam, there's a lot of options. But like recently, most of the clients that we've been dealing with, they're looking for more of a ready built, because they want speed. They're in a hurry to move, so they would like a ready built factory that they can just move in a very short time. Or they maybe want to build the suit, so it's a little bit faster. That they're not doing just from raw land. But if you have a larger facility and you need the time, you can buy the land, build your factory, and do a more elaborate process. It's just right now, most of the companies that I've been working with, they're really wanting speed, so they're going for either build to suit or ready built, and we can move in a matter of 3 to 6 months.
Right. Look, we've got one final question. I know we're 4 minutes over. If you have to hop off, that's fine. We do want to get to this final question clients have asked us about, which is around feasibility study. Look at the last one, talk about, will feasibility study include a review of energy costs, corruption index, and security measures, and also about the feasibility study, can you include in there a section around a country's potential markets that you can sell into as well as export to the U.S. Mark, if you would tackle that one first.
So I was saying there's 15 to 20 metrics that we look at, when you begin to evaluate one country versus another, one region versus another. And certainly in these energy costs, corruption index, safety and security factors, they're all part of the metrics that you look at. The metrics is to make sure you're addressing all those. Some areas are more important than others. Energy costs, for example, natural gas, pretty hard to get a hold of in Mexico, but readily available in Vietnam and in Thailand, right? So corruption index may be a little more of a concern in Mexico in some areas than it would be in Thailand. So, but all those are on your checklist when you begin to compare and contrast countries versus regions versus industrial parks, even down to that level, for sure.
That's great. Look, well, that is that's we're 5 minutes afterwards. That concludes today's event. we have additional questions around Indonesia, we'll be responding to that separately. Did want to say that this PowerPoint will be sent out to the attendees. We'll have a recording and a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. We'll be going to them. I think will be coming from East West, and you will also be received a webinar survey. We'd ask you to fill that out and come back to us, and we'll be reaching out in the next week to communicate with you to answer any follow-up questions you have. So with that, I'd like to conclude it. I'd like to thank Mark Plum and Jacob Miller for doing a great job. I'd like to thank all the questions we received. And again, we look forward to having you again on the future webinars. And we will now conclude today's webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.